Hello everybody. So for this video, what we're going to look at is the period when the Cold War turns hot. It's really kind of implementing the containment strategy that Harry Truman had um, really kind of announced as America's default foreign policy in 1947 by announcing the Truman Doctrine in support for Greece and Turkey. Um, the first real critical test for the containment theory for American foreign policy comes the following year in 1948. That year sees a number of major developments that ultimately really intensify the Cold War and serve as a major test for the new containment policy. Early that year, the Soviets basically sponsor a coup in Czechoslovakia, which at that point was the last remaining democracy in Central and Eastern Europe under Soviet control, and put in place a hardline Soviet backed puppet dictatorship in Czechoslovakia that would last for the next 4 decades. Um, and so after the basically the coup in Czechoslovakia, um, the Soviets next make moves to try to consolidate their power in Germany, as do the Western Allies, United States, France, and Britain. By 1948, it was clear that reunification of Germany, which had been divided into respective zones of occupation between the United States, Great Britain, France, and in the East, the Soviet Union, it was clear that reunification of Germany was not going to happen. And so basically, what happens is that both sides, both the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union, move rapidly to consolidate their respective zones of occupation into new countries, basically. An American backed West Germany, what would come to be known as the Federal Republic of Germany or West Germany, and in the Soviet East, what they would refer to as the Deutsche Democratic Republic, or DDR, or as it's more commonly known, East Germany. Um, and so the United States and its allies make this move first in early 1948. And Stalin responds to this move to consolidate power and to create this new West German government by cutting off access to the Western occupied portions of Berlin. Now, Berlin, much like the rest of Germany, was divided amongst the victorious Allies. There was a there was a British sector, an American sector, a French sector, and a Soviet sector in Berlin. Roughly speaking, the city of Berlin, much like Germany itself, was divided between a liberal democratic West and a Soviet communist East. Um, and so as and so basically much like the rest of Germany, it was divided. Now, unlike the rest of Germany, Berlin exists as a city well within the Soviet zone of Soviet occupation zone, what would eventually become East Germany. It's more than 110 miles within the confines of what would become East Germany. And as such, it's kind of in a vulnerable position. And because of that, because of the fact that Berlin was a divided city with a democratic West Berlin and a communist East Berlin, it would routinely become a flashpoint over the next several decades of the Cold War. And 1948 is the first time it will. Basically, when the US and Great Britain and France decide to consolidate their power in West Germany and create this new West German government, Stalin retaliates by cutting off overland road and rail access to Berlin. Now, this creates an immediate problem for President Truman, not just for President Truman, but for the more than 2 million civilians living in Berlin. Now, by this point, it's worth mentioning this is just 3 years after the end of World War II. Rebuilding is still in its very early stages. Much of West Berlin is still uninhabitable. And things like access to running water and electricity and other things are scarce. People need outside access to clean drinking water, to food, to medicine, to clothing, and all kinds of other things. And so when Stalin cuts off the overland routes into Berlin, he's effectively threatening to starve those more than 2 million people, and to basically leave them to die, essentially. Um, and so naturally, that's not the kind of thing that Truman can just do nothing about. Basically, Stalin was hoping that by closing Western access to Berlin, that it would negatively impact Truman ahead of the 1948 election, which would prove to be one of the most contentious elections in American history, certainly one of the more dramatic. Um, but and he really put Truman in a bit of a bind. Obviously, Truman knew that he couldn't respond by launching a full-fledged offensive against the Soviets. For one thing, the Soviet forces in Eastern Europe outnumbered American forces there by a factor of more than 2 to 1. Um, and secondly, he knew that launching a full-fledged military campaign against the Soviets would be deeply unpopular at home, with the U.S. having just gotten out of World War II. But he also recognized equally that he couldn't just sit back and let the Soviets kick the U.S. and the Western Allies out of Berlin. And so instead of just sort of going all in and launching a full-fledged attack, or on the other end just appeasing the Soviets, Truman opts for a third um, approach to dealing with this. One very much in keeping with the kind of measured but firm response that had been advocated by George Kennan in the Long Telegram, in which he outlined the containment theory 2 years earlier, in 1946. Rather than allowing the Soviet um, blockade of Berlin to go unanswered, President Truman responds by ordering the newly independent United States Air Force, which had just been created the prior year in 1947. He orders the Air Force to send all of its cargo planes and to begin this massive year-long airlifting operation into Berlin, which is of course why this becomes known as the Berlin Airlift. And so over the course of the next year, slow-moving, unarmed American, British, and French cargo planes fly into the narrow approaches into Berlin's Tempelhof Airport, and deliver more than 2 million tons of supplies to the starving and destitute civilian population of Berlin. And basically, what Truman had done by inaugurating this airlift into Berlin is he had essentially shifted the balance of action into the Soviet court. He had essentially kicked the ball back into Stalin's court and said, "Okay, you want to play hardball? This is how we're going to do it. You want to try to kick us out of Berlin? Well, are you going to shoot down these unarmed cargo planes flying in food and medicine and other humanitarian supplies?" And naturally, the answer to that, even with somebody as vicious as Stalin, is no. And so basically, after a year of this round the clock, 24/7 air operation, Stalin does exactly what Kennan had predicted he would do in that circumstance. He backs down and he reopens the roads and railways leading into Berlin, and provides Truman and the United States its first clear victory in the Cold War. A victory which also helped boost President Truman to victory in the 1948 presidential election against Republican Thomas Dewey. Not the only challenger he faced, but definitely the most serious. Um, so it proves to be a big boost for Truman. It in many ways validates in many people's minds the containment thesis of Kennan, and really from that point, it's pretty much accepted as conventional established wisdom at this point. However, the celebrations don't last very long. Just a few months after the Berlin airlift ends triumphantly for Truman and for the United States, with the Soviets reopening the overland routes to Berlin, um, Truman suffers arguably the single biggest political defeat in both foreign and domestic terms of his presidency, when the Chinese Civil War ends with the establishment of a communist regime in China, the People's Republic of China, and the victory of Mao Zedong. Now, basically, a little bit of background to this. Um, even before World War II, in the late 1920s, there had begun the civil war in China between the nationalist government led by Chiang Kai shek and the communist forces led by Mao Zedong. The Civil War actually began in 1926. When the Japanese invaded in 1937, the respective sides of the Chinese Civil War agreed to put aside their hostilities and face the more looming threat of the Japanese together. But rather than the war bringing them together, once the war ended, pretty much, and the Japanese had been dealt with, they were like, okay, all right, let's get back to killing each other. And so the Civil War resumes in earnest, basically the moment that the Japanese are defeated. Um, During this time period, the United States continues to back the regime of the nationalist leader Chiang Kai shek. Ultimately, the U.S. provides Chiang with more than $3 billion worth of economic and military aid to win the war against Mao and the Chinese. In spite of this, because of the fact that Chiang was both incompetent and corrupt and deeply unpopular with the Chinese, the still largely peasant Chinese population, in 1949, Mao and the communists emerged victorious. Now, immediately, President Truman's political opponents, especially Republicans, but also some Southern Democrats who hoped to derail his various civil rights initiatives, um, they immediately began accusing Truman of having not done enough to stop China from falling to the communists. They accuse him of having, quote unquote, lost China and being soft on communism. And so this proves to be a rather damaging moment for Truman politically, and one that ends up having decades worth of repercussions. The fear of being seen as weak on communism or of being, or and the fear of suffering another humiliating loss like the one that Truman suffered in China in 1949, which again, absent a complete American military intervention, would have had the same result as it ended up having. Um, Decades worth of American politicians, especially Democrats, will become intensely fearful of being seen as weak on communism, and as such will adopt the most maximalist, most aggressive foreign policy possible in dealing with the Soviet Union. Again, this is true of most American politicians, but this is particularly true of Democratic politicians who, being the more liberal party, are weary of being of people trying to lump them in with being accused of being fellow travelers, or as the term was known at the time period, or being sympathetic to communism. And so ultimately this will lead the United States down this primrose path that will culminate not only in the very near future in the American war in Korea, but ultimately and disastrously in the American war in Vietnam. The desire to preserve American prestige, the desire not to be seen as weak in combating communism, will, in both instances, be a preeminent instinct in those conflicts. So this is one of those moments that you don't really hear a lot about talked about in American history, but it is definitely one that ends up having rather serious repercussions for the future, especially when we look at the way that the war in Vietnam would eventually unfold over the course of the next 20 odd years. Um, but more immediately, the desire to kind of reclaim his anti-communist bona fides, and the desire to not again be accused of being weak on communism will lead the United States the following year into a war in Korea. Now, the origins of the war in Korea actually can, like many aspects of the Cold War, be traced back to the way that the Second World War ended. Basically, Korea, which the Korean Peninsula, had been a Japanese colony since 1910, and under Japanese influence even longer. But in the last week of World War II, when the Soviets launched that massive offensive in Manchuria, they managed to seize the northern half of the Korean Peninsula. And so once World War II ends in August of 1945, the Korean Peninsula, much like Germany, is divided between the United States and the Soviet Union, with the division being drawn at the 38th parallel. And so after World War II ends, Korea is divided between a Soviet controlled North and an American controlled South. Um, Within 3 years of this agreement, both the United States and the Soviet Union, respectively, had put in place governments in North Korea, a communist dictatorship under Kim Il sung, who incidentally is the grandfather of the current North Korean dictator, Kim Jong un. It's North Korea is a weird place. It's basically a hereditary monarchy, but also a Stalinist communist dictatorship at the same time. Um, Again, it defies traditional definition. But anyway, um, so you have a Soviet-backed regime in Pyongyang in North Korea under Kim Il Sung, established in 1948. That same year, you have an American-backed, ostensibly democratic regime in South Korea under Syngman Rhee, established, which is really not all that democratic in actuality, but is, and is quite authoritarian, but is still, you know, anti-communist and so therefore acceptable to the U.S. Um, After the establishments of respectively North and South Korea, the United States and the Soviet Union both actually withdraw much of their military forces from the Korean Peninsula. Neither country prior to 1950 considered Korea to be essential to their strategic interests. Both countries focused most of their attention on Eastern and Western Europe at the time period, and so by 1950 there are very few American troops in Korea. Um, but the situation in the Korean Peninsula remained tense ever since the establishment of North and South Korea in 1948. There had been fighting along the 38th parallel between North Korean and South Korean forces. Finally, in June of 1950, the North Korean dictator Kim Il sung orders 90,000 North Korean troops south of the 38th parallel to invade South Korea. This North Korean invasion immediately takes the relatively small number of American troops in Korea, many of whom were poorly trained, completely by surprise, as it does the South Korean military. Within a matter of days, Seoul is taken, and within a matter of weeks, the American and South Korean defenders are pushed into a small defensive pocket of about 75 mile wide perimeter around the port city of Busan, modern day Busan, South Korea, the Busan perimeter as it comes to be known. Um, when the North Koreans invade South Korea, President Truman mistakenly thinks that they are doing so under orders from Stalin. And it's at this point that he does something really quite unprecedented, but which has major repercussions for the future. Um, Rather than going through Congress to seek a congressional declaration of war against North Korea, which, after all, had attacked American forces in South Korea, President Truman instead bypasses Congress, goes to the United Nations, and because the Soviet Union was boycotting the UN Security Council because of the unwillingness of the U.S. to seat a representative from the People's Republic of China on the UN Security Council, which they wouldn't until 1971, um, the UN passes a resolution condemning North Korean aggression and authorizing President Truman and the U.S. to lead a multinational force to repel the North Korean invasion. Something which Truman tries to downplay the seriousness of to the American people by calling it a quote unquote police action in South Korea. And so basically, what the Korean War amounts to in this regards is a massive expansion of executive power at the expense of Congress, something which would only intensify over the next several presidents and which would ultimately culminate quite disastrously in a near complete abdication of congressional oversight during Vietnam and the expansion of the imperial presidency. as it's commonly known, especially in foreign affairs. But anyway, so having secured this UN resolution, Truman appoints General Douglas MacArthur, who had commanded American troops in the Philippines and then had in turn liberated the Philippines in 1944, a hero in other words, a war hero in other words, to command the UN force, which would ultimately involve not only troops from the United States and South Korea, but 16 other countries as well, essentially turning the Korean conflict into a world war in miniature. So MacArthur, after being appointed to command UN forces in Korea, he decides he's going to try to reverse the momentum of the war in a very risky and but quite aggressive gambit. And so what he ends up doing is he lands a invasion force of American Marines 180 miles behind North Korean lines at Incheon in September of 1950. Um, MacArthur had gambled that doing so would take the North Koreans by surprise, and he was proven correct. And the Incheon landings result in American and UN forces very rapidly pushing the North Koreans back northward and ultimately beyond the 38th parallel. Now, at this point, for the first and only time during the Cold War, American strategy shifts from mere containment of the Soviet Union and of communism to rolling back communist expansion. And so when North Korean forces are pushed north of the 38th parallel in October of 1950, President Truman authorizes MacArthur's forces to pursue them. And they do ultimately pursue the North Koreans all the way up the Korean Peninsula, getting to within 40 miles of the Yalu River and the border with China. Now, at this point, President Truman is wary of the Chinese coming into the war and, on the North Korean side and disrupting the conflict. And he orders MacArthur to halt. MacArthur, who was very contemptuous in his attitude towards President Truman, who he oftentimes referred to as a mere artillery captain, a dismissive description of President Truman's World War I service, MacArthur ignores the order, and American troops advanced within 30 miles of the Chinese border. At which point, just as Truman had feared, 33 divisions of more than 300, containing more than 300,000 Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River and rapidly overwhelmed the American and UN forces. By the end of the year, American and UN forces had once again been pushed south past the 38th parallel. The South Korean capital city of Seoul was once again retaken by communist forces. And so, over the course of 3 bitter months in the winter of 1950 and 51, American and UN forces have to literally claw their way back in oftentimes sub-zero, incredibly bitterly cold conditions against the Chinese and North Korean forces. By the spring of 1951, they had managed to push the North Koreans and the Chinese back to the 38th parallel. And at this point, the war enters into a stalemate with fixed lines of trenches and fortifications, and in many ways much more resembles the fighting of the First World War than it does the War of Movement that we associate with World War II. At this point, with the war having become a stalemate, but also feeling that the U.S. had satisfied its pledge to defend South Korea and to repel the North Korean invaders, President Truman decides to seek a negotiated peace to end the Korean War. This immediately angers General MacArthur, who then decides to completely upend the traditional chain of command and the notion of civilian control of the military, and goes to the press and publicly criticizes Truman for seeking a negotiated peace short of absolute victory, calling it defeatist, also putting forth his own plan, which called for the use of nuclear weapons, potentially against China and North Korea. And needless to say, Truman is not pleased about this. And he immediately fires MacArthur for this very clear act of insubordination. Now, ever since, most military and political leaders have said that this was the right thing for Truman to do because MacArthur had violated the notion of civilian control of the military and the chain of command in the military by publicly criticizing Truman, and that doing so was ultimately essential to maintaining that constitutional principle of civilian control of the military. However, at the time, it proves to be very, very politically unpopular. And as a result of the public um, reaction against Truman's decision to fire MacArthur, the reaction, the negative public reception that Truman receives for this is so significant that he ultimately opts not to run for re-election in 1952. He would have been the last American president to be eligible for a third term in office because he was basically grandfathered in from the recently ratified 22nd Amendment, which limits a president to 2 terms. And so he opts not to run for that third term in office because of the backlash he faces for the firing of MacArthur. Even though, again, most historians and most political and military leaders have since said that it was the right thing to do on Truman's part. Um, anyway, so in 1952, the principal Republican nominee that year is Dwight Eisenhower, who criticizes Truman's plans in his approach to Korea, and wins re-election, or wins election, I should say. But nonetheless, the war ends just as Truman had sought, with a negotiated settlement. Um, and I say ends in the military, not the full sense. Ultimately, Eisenhower goes to Korea as he had pledged in the 1952 presidential campaign, and an armistice is agreed to in July of 1953 at Punamungin. That results in the return of American POWs and an armistice and basically the resumption of the pre-war boundaries between North and South Korea at the 38th parallel, which then proceeds to become the most heavily fortified border on planet Earth, as it remains today. Um, Notably, the war does not end with a formal peace treaty between the U.S. and North Korea. So, in the technical sense of the term, the Korean War is actually still an ongoing conflict because there had been an armistice, but not a formal peace treaty. So, this is one of those things that you see whenever people in North Korea talk about this, as if the war is still going on, because in their minds it still is. But anyway, the Korean War, uh, although it was unpopular in many ways because of the less than satisfying ending, it was seen by many American political and military leaders as a success, a limited success, certainly, but a success nonetheless. And ultimately, as a result of the success of Korea, the United States decides to involve itself much more in containing the spread of communism, which by this point has moved beyond the kind of immediate enemy in the form of the Soviet Union that Kennan had written about in the 1946 Long Telegram to this sort of generalized idea of international communism, which is in many cases envisaged as a sort of foreign-born contagion. Um, the U.S. Ultimately embraces this idea of containing communism through military action. To that end, American defense expenditures soar during the Korean War. By the end of the conflict, $2 out of every $3 that the United States is spending in terms of federal tax dollars is spent on military appropriations, military-related appropriations. And not just appropriations for the United States, appropriations for many of America's allies. And it's this that leads us to turn our attention to events in Southeast Asia. Um, Following American forces in the minds of many American leaders effectively holding the line in South Korea, the U.S. next turns its attention to the French colony of what was then known as Indochina, French Indochina, modern day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Um, Essentially, a little bit of background here. Basically, in the late 19th century, starting in 1858, the French had successively conquered and then colonized Vietnam and Indochina, turning them into very lucrative rubber plantation areas for the French, that the French used for the rubber trade. Um, the population's toleration of the French regime in Vietnam in particular had never been very strong. And there had always been efforts to try to launch independence movements. But this picked up considerable speed during World War II. During World War II, when France itself was occupied by German forces, um, the new collaborationist government in France, known as the Vichy government, basically allowed the Japanese, after they became allies of Germany in June of 1940, to come in to Vietnam that following September and basically take over the country. So the French essentially um, surrendered Vietnam during World War II to the Japanese, who used it for their own war-related needs, their own raw material needs, without a fight. And so during the war, the only meaningful resistance to the Japanese occupation came not from the French colonial officials or the French colonial government, but rather from the indigenous Vietnamese population, specifically a indigenous insurgency led by a man named Ho Chi Minh, which materialized by early 1945. Ho Chi Minh began waging an insurgency against the Japanese in 1945. And to that end, Ho Chi Minh's forces received considerable material support from the United States. Not only did Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh fighters, as they called themselves, aid and help downed American airmen evade capture in Vietnam, but they also received large amounts of American military, medicinal, and other aid in their fight against the Japanese. And so, understandably, when World War II ended, and with the United States having declared itself and pledged itself to this idea of the promotion of self-determination in the post-colonial world, the Vietnamese expected that the United States would endorse their movement for independence. However, because Ho Chi Minh had declared himself a communist, in the context of the new Cold War, this was no longer something that was acceptable to the United States. And so, as a result, the United States ultimately backs a French effort to reestablish colonial control over their colony that they refer to as Indochina, which again includes Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And so, from 1946 to 1954, the French waged a increasingly ferocious war in Indochina. A war so controversial in France that many in France come to refer to it as La Sale Guerre, or the Dirty War, with an increasing amount of American support. The troops that fought the First Indochina War, which is what the early phase of the Vietnam War is called, after World War II, were French or French colonial troops, but the money to fight the war came from the United States. By 1954, fully 80% of the military expenditures and military resources that the French were allocating to fight the war against Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh forces in the jungles and mountains of Vietnam came from the United States. And so basically the United States is essentially bankrolling the French military effort in Vietnam by 1954. Despite this, that same year, the French suffer a humiliating defeat at the siege of Dien Bien Phu, where an entire French army is surrounded and besieged and ultimately forced to surrender to Ho Chi Minh's forces. And in the aftermath of this French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the French agree to a withdrawal, which results in the partitioning and division of Vietnam into two halves, the Geneva Accords. At the Geneva Accords, Vietnam is divided at the 17th parallel between a communist-dominated North Vietnam and an ostensibly democratic South Vietnam. Under the terms of the Geneva Accords, not only do the French eventually agree to withdraw from Vietnam, but there is also a provision put in place to allow eventually for elections to be held within 2 years to determine whether or not South Vietnam would unify with North Vietnam, whether in fact they two would become one countries. The two would become one country, that is. Now, up to this point, the American involvement in Vietnam has been largely material, but still decidedly at a distance. But with the French withdrawal and the threat of South Vietnam eventually being absorbed by North Vietnam, American political leaders, including President Dwight Eisenhower, become determined to prevent South Vietnam from falling from joining the ranks of communist nations. They are guided principally in this belief by something known as the domino theory, which is this idea that if you allow South Vietnam to fall to communist forces and join up with North Vietnam as a unified communist state, that all of the surrounding other nations in Southeast Asia, including neighboring Laos, Cambodia, as well as Thailand, Burma, Indonesia, potentially even Japan, could fall into the communist orbit. So it's this belief that if you let South Vietnam fall to communism, that the rest of Southeast Asia would likewise fall like a stack of dominoes. And so this becomes the principal framework by which American policy leaders begin thinking about Vietnam after the French withdrawal. And so after the French withdrawal in 1954, American forces rapidly come in. The United States rapidly steps in to prop up and support the government in South Vietnam led by Ngo Dinh Diem. Now, Diem is hardly democratic in any meaningful sense of the word. He refuses to hold the referendum in 1956 that would have likely resulted in the unification of North and South Vietnam. And he's deeply unpopular with the Vietnamese population at large. Yet despite this, because of his stated anti-communism, the U.S. increasingly funnels massive amounts of money and increasingly manpower to backing up the Diem regime. Because of Diem's unwillingness to hold the referendum that the Geneva Accords called for, and because of the unpopularity of his regime, by the end of the Eisenhower administration, an insurgency had developed against him in the South Vietnamese countryside. A insurgency that eventually came to refer to itself as the National Liberation Front, or as they were more commonly known, the Viet Cong. And as this insurgency against Diem's unpopular government intensifies, the American commitment in Vietnam does as well. By the end of Eisenhower's presidency in January of 1961, the United States is not only funneling increasingly massive amounts of money for military equipment and economic aid, but it is also increasingly supplying American military expertise in the form of more than 900 American military advisors. So by the end of Eisenhower's administration, there are already nearly 1,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. And although they're there in an officially non-combat capacity, this highlights the centrality of Vietnam to American anti-communist efforts in the Third World, effort that would only intensify during the presidency of Eisenhower's successors, Lyndon Johnson, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson, the latter of whom would ultimately transform Vietnam into a full-fledged American war by 1965. So that's all for that. And when we get to the next video, we'll look at the domestic ramifications of the Cold War in terms of the Second Red Scare, and we'll also look at the emerging civil rights movement. So that's it for that. Peace.